We've been going through a series of Advent. Can somebody help me today? My voice is a little raspier today. Can somebody help me with Advent? Somebody say Advent. Oh, can we help me out a little bit more here? Advent. We've been going through Advent series, and hopefully it's been a different angle on which we've kind of gone into this season. We've been going through the genealogy of Jesus and how these several characters that have been written, even in the first 4 verses, have been very striking characters in Jesus' genealogy. Jesus' genealogy is a resume. Many men and women of acclaim back in the days would give their genealogy, and it would be proof that they're royalty. It would be proof that there's something, that their lineage is important. And so in Jesus' lineage, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, creator of earth and heaven, we see in his genealogy some real interesting characters, right? And so first 2 weeks we went through a character named Tamar, a foreigner, a woman that had kind of an interesting, sketchy past. Last week we talked about Ruth and how Ruth as a Moabite clung on to Naomi. And through their journey, God brought redemption and ultimately a new line through the kinsman redeemer Boaz. And we know the story well. And so we've been kind of hitting the angle through the characters that are listed in the genealogy. And today, we have the wonderful story that we might all be aware of, that we know, the story of David and Uriah's wife. And today, I put the series with the name Uriah's wife because in Matthew chapter 1, the name isn't written there. It's written as Uriah's wife. And it's an interesting way to kind of put the name of somebody in Jesus' genealogy, but it is written in that way. And you know, today we live in a world that's, because of social media. I know Rio kind of commented on maybe the age being a little bit younger these days. In our age, right, growing up, and I include myself in that young age bracket, just FYI. In our age, we've grown up with, TikTok and, before TikTok, we had, Instagram, Facebook, MySpace, whatever. We've grown up with this social media times. And I think just because news is more easily accessible, I think we hear more about what happens around the world, right? And so if you guys can kind of, I know we don't like to think about or talk about COVID much anymore, right? But it's like when we think back to COVID times, I just remember during that time thinking, like, what's next? And it was like there was scandal. You see where I'm going? There was a scandal, leaders, respected men, usually men, but it's like a lot of leaders that we looked up to started to have these issues or secret sin that came out into the open. It's almost like we're stuck at home and we're just scrolling Instagram or we're scrolling the news, Christian news, and we see a lot of these issues with leadership. And it almost felt like during that time that it was just one blow after the other. Men that were respected, that were men of God, that had platforms and influence. They had some kind of hidden sin brought out into the open in shocking ways. And it was a heartbreaking time. And I don't want to mention names because we all know kind of some of the names that kind of came out during that time. And it was like, man, I know pastors are not kings. And we're going to be talking about the story of King David. And I know pastors are not kings. But maybe in the West or maybe even in Korea, pastors have built platforms or ministries and have kind of built up their own kingdom in such a way where they've kind of created environments where they operated in some senses like kings without accountability. Maybe they were in this ivory tower, disconnected, kind of isolated, doing the work of the ministry, but in their hearts, they acted in secret in ways that were removed from their public image or character. This message today wasn't an easy message for me to carry this week. Just want you guys to know that. We're talking about some of the most scandalous moments in history. We're talking about some of the most heart-wrenching, heartbreaking moments. in history that's recorded in the Bible. The man of God, the anointed of God, the leader that captured the heart, imagination of a whole nation. He acted so far out of his character, so removed from who he was in God, that he abused his power. He betrayed his closest friend, mighty man. He's recorded, Uriah's name is recorded as a mighty man of God, one of his homies. One of the homies that would have died for David, he made sure he died because of his sin. David killed him because of his own sin. It's a scandalous story. Man of God. The man who wrote 73 Psalms, a poet, a skillful worshiper, celebrated, anointed, powerful, charismatic. Like, this was the man. King David. King David was the man. But yet, how is it that this man connived, impregnated, and ultimately murdered his homie, his friend? If this man of God, is capable of doing such sin, heinous sin, then like, what's there for us? What about for us, right? What about for the regular person? Like, who's safe then? If he was such a leader and a man of God, and it's recorded that this dude was a man after God's own heart, who's safe then? What hope is there for us in today's modern age if the man of God is sleeping around and killing his friends? And we've been going through this genealogy, and it's messy, y'all, right? It's messy. We're talking about the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Jesus is coming. Advent, it means he's coming. And immortalized and tied in with this genealogy of Jesus is David and Uriah's wife. Uriah's wife. We see the sins of David being written and scribed on paper, on pen and paper, for us all to see. That perhaps in Jesus' incarnation and his entrance into the world, that Jesus or God did not shy away from the reality of the human experience, the range of human experience, the lows and the highs, the lowest of lows and the highest of highs. You see, King David, I feel like his life, it was a good, he shows a good range of the highs and the lows, all of the human experience. We can see that it was messy and broken, yet God is faithful to write his redemptive history through King David and through his children. You see, as we go through this series on the gospel and kind of remembering Jesus' coming, part of receiving the message of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, is to recognize the brokenness and acknowledge the brokenness that precedes it. That the condition of man, the fallen condition of man, even at our best, in our best self-improvement, biohacking, productive, full capacity, we can talk about all these wonderful things to maximize our human capacity, or we could even talk about spiritual things, going to church, praying, fasting. We can be the utmost model Christian. But at the end of the day, if we do not remember that we are but earthen vessels carrying these treasures of clay, if we forget that we are earthen, if we forget that we are human, broken systems that leak, if we do not remember this or acknowledge this, then we don't make space or room for the gospel to be good, to be necessary. And it's almost like Jesus is including the mess in the genealogy to show us why he came, to show us that he had to come. And so, none of us, none of you and me, are exempt from the pervasive condition that we are broken systems that cannot hold water on our own. I leak, you leak, I desire, I want, I covet, I misstep, I fight my giants, I conquer them, but sometimes I fall. And even in my conquering of my challenges and giants, I could conquer Goliaths and bears, but there's an enemy too within. My own desire. My enemy is often within my own heart. And sometimes familiarity with myself or comfort, like the comfort that I have in my ego, can create blind spots and unconscious patterns of want and action that leak out. In simple terms, what I repress, it leaks. And so when we're talking about King David, we're going a little deep today. We're talking about King David. He had all the power. He had the greatest amount of victories. He brought the kingdoms together and unified them. He was a mighty man, had men that followed him and gave their lives for him. He had throngs of women that threw themselves at him and fawned over him. He had all the power and favor from God and man. Yet in the moments of idleness, in the moments of his greatest success, we catch him slipping into great sin, into the deepest sin of his life that created a reverberating effect for the rest of his life. You see, up until this point, his come up was a success story, a masterclass in leadership. Like people, we study it, right? We study the life of David, and we gain so much wisdom and insight about how God raises spiritual leaders. But from this point onwards, from his sin onwards, we see that it's just quite hard for the remainder of his reign. It's hard in the kingdom, it's hard in his family, and he's never the same after his sin. And so in 2 Samuel, I'm only going to go in bits and pieces because I want to kind of take us more in a bird's eye view. I'm not going to get too much into the story and ins and outs, the anatomy of his sin, but I want to kind of take us bird's eye view through his life and through his response to God and what God does through of it. I want us to kind of see the grace of God through his life, in his life, the redemptive thread through his life. And so 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1, it says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, you see already, this is a time that he would have normally gone out to battle. But he sends Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Verse 2, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. And so, from this moment, we see his sin. He dives into this situation. In his idleness, and if you read back a couple of chapters, like he's generous to all of Saul's descendants. He takes care of them, so he's very gracious as a man. He's very generous. He wins battles, and so he brings peace and victory to Israel. And so King David, he's doing all right. He's doing good. Peak of his success. And so he's like, I'm not going to go out to battle, so I'll let him go. I'll let Joab go, my boy go, and I'm going to stay at home. So he's on the palace, looking down at his kingdom, right? All that he owns. And he happens to come upon this situation. And so you could argue, like, did she set him up? We could get into all of that. Is it adultery? Is it murder? Is it rape? There's like so many theological issues in that. But the reality is that in David's life, when he was successful, he dropped his guard. You see, in his come up, when he was running away from Saul, when he was hiding in caves, when he was struggling and when he had to cling to God and wait on God's timing, He was anointed to be king, but he wasn't appointed yet. And so 15 years he's in the wilderness trying to get to the place that God has called him. And so he's still not fully there in his promise. And this theme is quite true throughout all of scriptures, right? It's like in the wilderness, the Israelites learn to cling. But in the promised land, they forget. And it's like David, he forgets. He drops his guard and he falls into temptation and into sin. And it's the humanity. It's the man David. His humanity is on full display. And it was God's grace to confront him in this. And you know this, how the story goes. He impregnates her, and then he makes sure that Joab actually brings Uriah back, hoping that Uriah would have relations with Bathsheba so that he could cover over the fact that he slept with her. But then Uriah is such an honorable and loyal man that he sleeps outside, and so he sends him into the hardest part of the battle to murder him and kill him. And so he covers over his sin. This is the anatomy of sin, right? We sin, we wrong, and we cover. And it was in God's grace to confront David. It was God's grace to confront David through Nathan, the prophet. You know, talking about, scandals, like, this is like, they say, the most documented sin outside of the original sin of Adam and Eve. There's so much meat. You can think about Psalms chapter 51 as well. And the Psalms that came out of the penitence and just the brokenness that David felt after he had sinned before God. And when we think about and kind of examine this sin and this issue in David's life, even today, as I was kind of opening up with kind of scandals and things that have happened to people of high profile, leaders of high profile, I believe the enemy delights in scandals. He delights in, broken pastors, broken communities, broken members. I believe he glories in them, right? It's kind of like putting deer with antlers. When they kill the deer, it's like a big hunt, Got this guy. I feel like Satan glories in being able to tempt and bring away and strike at the head of God's people. Because you strike the head and the sheep scatter. You strike the shepherd and the sheep scatter. And so, I grew up in a pastoral family. And so my dad's a pastor. And, there's spiritual warfare that goes around, growing up as a kid too, as being in a pastoral family. I remember having intense spiritual dreams and moments where I really believe it was the enemy tormenting me. And I would wake up and have nightmares and things like that. And as I look back, I'm man, the enemy wants to destroy my dad for his ministry and bring some kind of obstacle. And so he's going to attack the family. The enemy doesn't, he loves low blows. There's nothing off guards for him, off the table for him. He's going to go low, and he's going to attack the weak. He's going to attack the children, the wives, attack the congregation. He's going to look for, it's kind of like the lion analogy, right? When a lion's hunting buffaloes, they look for the weak buffalo that's lagging behind, or one that has a sickness or is young. And it's the enemy, he loves bringing scandals into God's people and leaders. And I say that, yet if we just look at David's sin today and simply blame the devil and spiritualize away, and say, the devil tempted David and David fell, and it was kind of the enemies all on the enemy, then I think we can really miss the reality that is our humanity. David's humanity. Sure, there is brokenness. And I'm not saying don't pray for your pastors. Pray for your pastors. Pray for your leaders. Pray for the men and the leaders of your family. Pray for your fathers. Pray for people that are in positions of responsibility, even in the country. But when we look at our story today, we still have to hold intention. We have to still see David's humanity on full display. That although it was him falling and being pulled away by temptation, there is a part of David, despite his legacy, despite his platform and power, there is an element of his humanity that was still broken. He was a man at the end of the day. He was a man. He was a man before a king. He was a boy before he was a man. And what I want to say with this is that God loved David. God loved David in all of his humanity, even when he fell and sinned. God loves all of David, despite his weakness and his failure. God still loved David so much so that he restored the honor in his line. And like when we think about David today, we don't think about a negative guy, right? Like I feel like we're living in a time where David's like the charismatic guy in the Bible that a lot of people love. You know, they'll quote, "One thing have I desired," or like Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Like we're quoting David, a man after God's own heart. And even in the New Testament, he was remembered as a man after God's own heart, one of the greatest kings. And so we see God's redemptive work even through David's fallen humanity, his weakest moments, his deepest valleys of failure and later betrayal, loss in his life. All of the things that he went through, the highest of highs, the victory of Goliath, bringing the kingdom together, becoming king, like everything was, God saw it. He saw David in his humanity, and he loved David. I think the temptation today is to see his failure, and we see leaders and go, if they did this thing in secret, we get, right, how could he, right? And that I found myself responding, right? How could he, right? His name's on like the ESV Bible, you know, like how could he, right? And there are times where it's like we're appalled, and I'm not saying we should not be appalled by sin, because I'm sure there are people here in this room too that have been in leadership where churches they've gone through these hardships, and it's caused pain, it's caused like deep pain and a loss of something, right? That you have to work through for years and years and years. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I'm sorry that you have to go through loss, pain, disappointment in leaders. The reality is, leaders are men, and people, we're all we have this condition as humans. It's not to justify his sin, but I think it's to not oversimplify and just write off somebody for one action to say that they are this person, that they're wrong, that they're right, that they're good, that they're bad. You know, there's a book that talks about, his name is Charles de Groot, and he wrote a book called When Narcissism Comes to the Church. And basically he says, we in the church, in the modern Western world, he's speaking more to the Western world, but he's saying, we appoint leaders and put them on a pedestal, and we project the type of leader that we want. And it attracts, in our modern world, narcissists. It attracts people that want that attention, that have the gifting, the charisma. And it's kind of like an idealization of what a leader that we want. But it's also to project what is broken as well. And what it unconsciously does is it kind of dehumanizes the leader. And it's quite common also in Korean or Eastern like religions where there's a high Eastern countries, or even like Middle East, like places that have high power distance, where we want to look up at our leader and kind of give that authority and like responsibility. We can really idealize a leader and unconsciously project like all of our desires of what we want, what's broken, what's wrong in that leader. And what it does inadvertently is that it dehumanizes them, and it kind of, we put them in a position as to deny their humanity. We don't allow them to be human. I'm not talking about like we're like dehumanizing them as like intentionally and making them feel like lesser than. I'm just saying unconsciously we're putting a standard that's unattainable on their heads. And so if they show an aspect of themselves that is not to that standard, in that, 목사님, like, pastor, you're not wearing a suit, like you're out in a tracksuit, and you're like, in a Korean church, it's like a suit. Like my daughter would be like, she would think that anyone that wears a suit is a 목사님, a pastor. So in Korea, like when we were down in Busan, she would see just a regular guy working, and he's like, oh, it's 목사님, right? Because that church, like 목사님 wears that attire, right? And it's like, we have this image sometimes, and that's kind of a lighter example, but it's like we can project them to be demigods or spiritual beings. And it was kind of like that with the kings back in the day. They had no king. All the other nations had a king. We're weak without a king. We're smaller without a king. We're insufficient without a king. So we need a king. To be a follower of Jesus is not to deny our humanity and be uber spiritual. It's not to have standards that are like so high compared to the world, where people come and see and be like, oh my gosh, they pray so much. And there's good in that. But I think a balance of like, man, like we can be human as believers. Not just as leaders, but all of us as believers. We can be human. We can be, in our mess, open to God, honest to God, in our failures, in our missteps, in our hidden sin. We don't have to stuff and hide those aspects to present a better version and image of ourselves. But we can be as we are, can present ourselves in all of our humanity to God, because His goodness, His love, His grace, the extent of it we do not know. It covers over all of our sin, all of our potential sin, our past sin, current sin. His love, the breadth of His love, the capacity for Him to love you is so great. But in our modern world, there's a temptation, and maybe it's not so modern. Back in Colossae, the church of Colossae, Paul speaks to the camp, and they're all about fasting, denying the flesh. They're all about dreams, about angels, and worshiping different like spiritual things. And in chapter 2, verse 18 of Colossians, he says, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, which is like intense discipline and fasting, and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. He's saying, don't let anyone create these different levels and systems of how spiritual you are. Don't be so given to denying yourself and your flesh so much. Like you could do it in your own strength. There's a deception that can come in when I'm like praying and fasting. I'm like striving after God, and you overdo it and you become so spiritual that there's no body or human part of you left. Like you have no hobbies. You have no like emotions. You're not able to let your guard down and just be you. Because God isn't asking. He's not saying you're disqualified if you're human and you still have issues to be dealt with. No. The gospel is He loves you as you are. Right here, right now. You bring all of you, your mess. You don't clean up to come to church, right? We've heard this before. But you come as you are. And it's in His love and His grace and His acceptance and forgiveness over you that you begin to change in His love. To be a follower of Jesus is to not rewrite our stories and just completely blot out all of our sins and all of the dysfunctions. That's a scary thought, for us to have to open to the deepest parts of our dysfunction and to come and bring that before God. It's a vulnerable thing to be open to someone and to God in such a way. To bring all of myself, my body, my past, my soul, my spirit, all of it as a living sacrifice to God. I believe this is actually training. We need to be trained in this as we walk with God for the long haul. In our relationship with God, it's a training in being able to open up all of our humanity, all of our brokenness, all of our weaknesses. As God brings to awareness through circumstances, through difficulties, through trials, as He brings these things to the surface, to bring that open and open that up to the Lord. Not to stuff it and say, that's wrong, it shouldn't be there, I should be there. I can't bring that up, no, that's too... No, actually, every part, what we repress will leak. What we repress and hide and cover will leak. What we open to the Lord and to the grace of God, He will heal. He will redeem. You see, in the story of David, his humanity was on display. And the nuance in which God deals with him is so instructive, and I want to kind of land on that point and this idea. And the nuance of how God deals with David is this. God is not afraid to confront David. In His grace and love for David, He confronts David. So Nathan coming was grace and love. God confronted his sin. And because of David's response to God and to Nathan, God gives consequence, but still brings a redeeming end to his consequences. There are some consequences of his sin that were so great that God wouldn't blot the consequences out. But God was faithful to still bring new redemption, a new line. He was still faithful to carve out a path for David and his descendants, and so that He would keep His covenant and promise to David. It's nuanced, right? When God deals with our sin, in His grace He confronts us, and we can open to Him and trust in Him. I know we can be afraid of consequences, and maybe we can cave in to the fear that, what if I open this up and then and then I'm gonna lose this. And sometimes we get caught in the cycle of being afraid of our consequences. But to open to a God is to know that there are consequences to sin. There are devastating effects of sin that affect us because we're humans. We have souls. We have spirits. When we're talking about the unusual, my professor calls lust an unusual sin because it's a sin that affects the body. It says in Corinthians that lust is a sin that affects your own body. It affects your own temple. It's not just a sin that affects others, but sin by its definition affects me, but also affects my community. If you look in the Old Testament, the sin of one would affect the community. So my sin has consequences for those around me. And my sin, when it's sexual, has consequences on my body. And so there are consequences to sin that we cannot deny. You could hide it, you could cover it, you could run from it, you could just pretend that it never happened, but it will leak, it will affect you, it will break you, it will do things in your spirit that whether you are trying to numb out or just turn away your attention to it or not, it's going to affect you regardless. Generationally, it affects. Sin, we cannot change that. But in the confrontation of our sin, to open to God and His grace and to say, it's all in your hands. The way that David responded to Nathan was, you're right. And I want to just read that real quick. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7, Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house, your master's wives, into your arms, gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this was not enough, or if this was too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in His sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this son. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel and before the sun. The consequences were grave. It was great. Because the sin of David was great. His position. He was the leader. God had given him so much. And because of his sin, there was grave consequences. I want us to read verse 13. This was David's response. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. watch this, I have sinned against the Lord. First and foremost, he recognized his sin was toward God and God alone. And as he recognized his sin, acknowledged his sin, as he opened up, he could have said, he could have killed Nathan in all his power. He could have just struck him, could have killed him, and just buried him, right? But he said, I have sinned against the Lord. The Lord, I have sinned against you, God. Opens and acknowledges his sin. And Nathan says to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die, nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord. The child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. God confronts David in grace. Because through David's response of repentance and opening up and acknowledging his sin against the Lord, God spares his life. And although the child dies, God gives him another child through Bathsheba, whom he allows to be Solomon, right? The king, the next king. You see, his consequences, God has put away his sin before God in his relationship with God. But the consequences of his sin in his leadership and his position, God still, in his love and grace, allows him to experience the consequence and brings redemption through his life. It's sobering. But I believe that this type of nuance, this type of truth and grace in the Bible, it's what's needed in today's society. We cancel people for one thing they say or one person that they relate with. And we're living in a place where we do things without, in some ways we can react by over-spiritualizing and being removed from the world. Or in some ways we can over-humanize and feel like everyone's okay and we can do whatever we want without any consequences of our actions. And we live our lives YOLO. On this life, we live as we want and it's fine, right? And it's almost like we kind of soothe ourselves by who else is doing what we're doing and we're like, yeah, we're okay. But it's like to over-spiritualize or to over-humanize is to miss the nuance of how God created the world. We are broken systems and we leak. We have brokenness. We have desires. We have great capacity for good and love and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and goodness, all the good capacities, but we also have capacity to do evil. This is humanity. That even a man like David with his great capacity to love and carry a nation had the capacity to sin in such a way. And you and I are not different. We have the same capacities to love, to do good, but to also sin. And there are consequences when we remove God from the equation and we live out in our sin. But the message of grace and the gospel is that no matter how big we've sinned and fallen short, that we find acceptance, forgiveness, restoration, and love and redemption in our mess. That we can come as we are. We can come out of hiding. We can come out of pretense. We don't have to project images of success to validate what's inside or to almost compensate for what's broken inside. We don't have to follow the currents of the world to show that we're satisfied and happy when inside we're broken. In the gospel, when we come out of hiding, when we're confronted by grace and we acknowledge our sin before God, He brings us in, He hems us in. For it says in Psalms chapter 103, verse 14, it says He knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. And this is the title of today's message, for He knows our frame. He knows my humanity. He knows my dysfunction. He knows my mess. He knows how far I am sometimes from the ideal of who I should be before God and others. He knows my deepest sin and deepest failure. He knows it all. He remembers that we are but dust, yet He still loves us, and He approaches us, and He pursues us, He covers over us. And although there may be consequences to our sin, when we put our life and all of what we are into His hands, He writes the story of redemption so masterfully. He is such an author and such a perfecter of our lives. And the beautiful thing about David's story is that David understands, in all of his faults, he understood that his sin was against God first and foremost, and that he understood that there was grace to start again. You know, he cried and he fasted for the child to not die. Yet when the child dies, it says, I'll read it for us. It might not be up there, but 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 16. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. A little bit down in verse 19, and David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. Then David arose from the earth, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes. And he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house. David had understood the grace of God and the kindness of God. And he had the grace. He knew that he had the grace to start again. The reality is that we are in a world that has sin, that has consequences. And as much as we try to fix the consequences of our sins or the sins of those around us, we could never fix fast enough for all that's in the world. But our life placed in God's hands, our hearts open to God in confrontation of our sin, in His grace, opens enough space for the channel of grace to flow, the current of His love to flow through and work in our lives in such a way to rewrite our story, to give us the true footing and strong footing, strong foundation for us to live in this world. We won't be perfect. We cannot fix all of our issues. But when we open our hearts and come out of hiding and acknowledge His grace, there may be consequences, but we're not caved in by our consequences, you see. Some of us, we can cave in by our conscience telling us what we should have done and what we shouldn't do. Sometimes for some of us, we're so in our conscience that it attacks us because we're not where we should be. We live in the gap of, I know I should be here, but I'm here. For some of us, our conscience attacks us because of the gap and says, why are you not there? Why are you not like this? What's wrong with you? And we can live in the consequences, trapped in our own consciences. But in the gospel, we can open up, come out of hiding, be honest, open to His grace, put our life in His hands, trust in Him. And the story of the gospel is being written out even in your life and in your story today. And so I want to invite the worship team to come up.